Hello everyone, welcome back to Mao's China. Now, I'm a little bit under the weather, so if I don't sound as enthusiastic as I perhaps should when talking about history, that's the reason why. But in this lesson specifically, we're going to be carrying on examining the concepts of agricultural industrial changes that took place during this early to mid period of Mao's regime, so from around the time of 1949 to 1965. And we're going to carry on by examining the desire that Mao had to develop agricultural cooperation and the establishment of cooperatives that would eventually lead to the establishment of the people's communes. Now, ultimately, these policies, along with some industrial policies, specifically the second five-year plan, which was the Great Leap Forward, would lead to one of the greatest, if not the most devastating famine that has ever happened within history. So it's important that we examine both the development of these policies and the general end state desire that Mao had when it came to the abolishment of private property, private land, and the creation of the people's communes. So that's what this lesson is going to be. We're going to talk about agricultural cooperation. We're going to explore the changes in agricultural policy from the Agrarian Reform Law, which we explored in the previous lesson, if you remember, to the forcible collectivization of agricultural land and the creation of what became known as APCs, producers cooperatives, agricultural producers cooperatives. So when we looked at the last lesson, we looked at the Agrarian Reform Law. We noted that the Agrarian Reform Law was only the first step in the redistribution of agricultural land. Mao did not suggest that we should enforce a full-scale collectivization policy immediately at the start of his regime. He recognized the importance of being able to slowly develop into a collectivization policy because he saw the problems that was faced when it came to the USSR's collectivization policies in the 1920s. So he recognized that this was something that had to develop over time, and so the Agrarian Reform Law was just one of many steps towards this establishment of the people's communes and the establishment of, or at least the abolition of private land. The CCP was intending to present a full-scale policy of agricultural redistribution, as well as the common ownership of land and the abolition of private ownership as a result of that particular policy. However, they were still very aware of the problems that were caused by collectivization if collectivization is done poorly. So they were very much aware of the problems that was caused by collectivization within the Soviet Union, specifically within the state, or at least the region at the time of Ukraine, and the subsequent famine that took place there, the Holodomor. Now, in 1951, a year after the Agrarian Reform Law, we see the introduction of MATs, mutual aid teams. Now, the MATs organized peasants into single households. Now, these were generally quite small, usually less than 10 per household. And this was seen as really the first step towards the establishment of the greater people's communes. The aim was to see the sharing of resources, such as tools, farm animals, etc., and so therefore we see a collective pooling together of labour in order to work the farms and to create greater agricultural output. This would also be beneficial for the poorer peasants who are able to produce more as smaller collectives rather than as individuals. So it allowed for the exactly like I said, the pooling together of resources, specifically labor resources, as well as resources such as tools and farm animals, as a way to create greater output when it comes to agricultural production. Now, these mutual aid teams would eventually spawn into the agricultural producers cooperatives. Now, the APCs really were made up of not 10 individuals within the household, but around 30 to 40 households. And they had similar roles to that of mutual aid teams, but they were, of course, a lot larger. Now, the state would take a share of the harvest, and those peasants who worked on the APCs would receive compensation by way of certain payments. So initially, there was a lack of positivity towards this particular policy, with richer peasants preferring to slaughter their own animals rather than join these cooperative groups. So we see that there was initially quite a lot of resentment towards the creation of these larger households, these larger agricultural producers cooperatives. But the results from the APCs were also disappointing as well. So from 1953 to 1954, we only see a production of grain rise of around 2%. Now, this is probably not enough to justify the such drastic changes in agricultural policy. Mao expected a lot more agricultural production, a lot more positive output when it came to the kind of policies that they were trying to implement. And so this led to almost a scrapping of all of these ideas and the creation of the forced collectivization policies. Mao wanted to see collectivization take place at a faster rate. And so therefore, rather than opting for a voluntary system where collectivization would take place, he decided to just enforce a policy instead. So on the one hand, he was very acutely aware of the fact that forced collectivization can spell disastrous outcomes for particular states, very much with the famine of the 1920s and the Holodomor in the back of his mind. But on the other hand, he wanted to see people enter into a system of collectivization. And when he saw that the earlier policies of mutual aid teams and the producers' cooperatives weren't producing the kind of agricultural outputs that he had expected, around 2% between 53 and 54, then he decided, you know what, we're just going to enforce a policy instead. Now, in July 1955, he demanded that there be an increase in the rate of collectivization. The ultimate goal would be to see the full scale abolition of private property across the entire state, as well as the full implementation of a pure system of collectivization. Now, in December 1955, we note that the 63 and a third of peasant households were part of an agricultural producers cooperative. So already the majority of peasant households were part of a pseudo-collectivization policy. They were already part of some kind of collective group, a collective cooperative. By 1956, just a month later in January, this number had increased to 80.3%. So we see that forced collectivization, in terms of achieving collectivization, was very, very successful, because it did achieve this this public ownership of land at an increased rate in just 1 month, going from 63% to 80%. By January of 1956, so just a year later, we start to see forced collectivization increase in pace, with there being the full abolition of private property shortly after this particular month, after January 1956. And we also see an increase in what are known as higher level APCs. So there was generally seen as sort of a hierarchy of agricultural producers cooperatives, because there were higher level APCs that were sometimes much larger, with the creation of households of sometimes hundreds of people. So we go from the early sort of experiments in collectivization with the mutual aids teams of around 10 peasants per household. We see then the introduction of APCs, the agricultural producers cooperatives, which establish much larger households, sometimes 30 to 40 people per household. And then we start to see, in January 1956, the introduction of higher level APCs, with the introduction of sometimes hundreds of peasants per household. And this would eventually devolve into the creation of the people's communes, something that we're going to examine in the next lesson. But by the end of 1956, we note that around 88%, nearly 90% of peasants were part of higher level APCs. So these larger households with sometimes hundreds of people living in them and working within this collectivized system were all part of these higher level APCs. Around 88% of peasants were established as part of the higher level APCs.